Cindy, Jill Whalen, I need to talk with you about Kyle Corbett. Sinking into a chair where she could keep Kyle in sight as he watched a video Dominique had left behind, Jill combed her fingers through her hair, then reached around and massaged the stiff muscles in her neck. She'd spent the night on the floor next to the couch, wanting to be nearby in case the little boy awoke. Unlike her, however, he'd slept soundly. But at least she'd put the long, dark hours to good use. And after much prayer and soul-searching, she'd reached a decision. "What's up, Jill?" After explaining the situation to the social worker, Jill took a deep breath. "I assume you'll be putting him in foster care, and I'd like to volunteer for the job." The surprised silence on the other end of the line lasted for several seconds. "That's a big responsibility, Jill." "I realize that. I also realize that Kyle is in desperate need of love, and I have plenty of that to offer. Plus, I'm the only one he knows on the island aside from Keith. Wouldn't it be better to place him in familiar surroundings where he's already comfortable?" "Of course, but there's more to it than that." Cindy proceeded to give Jill a rundown on the requirements for foster parenting, echoing much of what Keith had said the previous night. "Are you up for all of that?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, Jill had decided that it was time to leave her sheltered, safe world and plunge back into the mainstream of life. She felt strong enough now to handle the pain of her past, and strong enough to deal with unkind strangers. If some people treated her differently because of her appearance, that was their problem. She had other, more important things to worry about, namely Kyle. With God by her side, she was confident she could find the courage to overcome her own challenges and make a difference in the little boy's life. "Okay, let me see what I can do to expedite things. I've already made one home visit. We've talked a couple of times. For now, I can leave Kyle with you, in the care of a neighbor, so to speak. We'll need to try and locate Kyle's father, too. But based on the conversation with Mr. Corbett, I doubt he wants to be found. Let me get things rolling, and I'll be in touch in a day or two." As she replaced the receiver, Jill did have one final, fleeting moment of doubt. But this was where her priors had led her, and Keith believed in her. With those two things to bolster her courage, she had to trust that all would turn out well. "Would you mind doing the reading, Keith? The page is marked." So lost in thought that he'd been as he stood beside the simple pine box containing the remains of Jeremiah Corbett, that Jill's request didn't register at once. When it did, Keith lifted his head and saw that she was holding out the Bible. "I'd do it myself, but I have my hands full already. She dipped her head toward Kyle, who was pressed close to her side and clinging to her other hand. Unable to think of a reasonable excuse to turn down the request, Keith reached for the book. He opened it to the marked page, the 23rd Psalm, and began to speak the lyrical prose so often used at commendations. The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. In verdant pastures he gives me repose. Beside restful waters he leads me. He refreshes my soul. As the words drifted through the quiet air, Keith looked over at Jill without breaking rhythm, reciting the passage by heart. Her head was bowed, her eyes closed. Beside her, Kyle's attention was riveted on the pine coffin. No other mourners had come to mark the passing of the old man. If not for the three of them, the gravediggers in the background would have been the only ones to witness his burial. And if it hadn't been for Jill, their little trio wouldn't be here either. But she'd insisted that whatever the man's faults, he should be sent to his rest with a prayer. When they'd been unable to establish any church affiliation, she'd taken it on herself to provide some words from the good book. Besides, she'd told him Kyle needed the closure. Keith hadn't disagreed, but he hadn't expected to find himself back in a role he thought he'd left behind forever. Nor had he expected it to feel so good. It was like putting on a pair of comfortable slippers after a long, painful walk in ill-fitting shoes. Finishing the psalm, he closed the book and bowed his head. Lord, we commend the soul of Jeremiah Corbett to your care, confident in your just and loving mercy. We also ask that you watch over those of us here today. Please give us strength and courage for the journey and challenges ahead. Amen. When Keith looked up, Jill gave him a misty smile. That was beautiful, Keith. Thank you. In silence, they turned to go, and as he took her arm to guide her over the uneven ground, that too felt good. The next few weeks flew by in a hurry of activity. Jill was kept busy chauffeuring Kyle around her medical tests. Jill was kept busy chauffeuring Kyle around for medical tests, eye exams, fittings for his new glasses, and counseling sessions, the latter requiring a ferry ride twice a week to Friday Harbor on the adjacent San Juan Island. She confirmed with Cindy often, who informed her that she'd located Kyle's birth records and that he should be starting school since he'd had his 6th birthday a couple of months before. However, both agreed he wasn't ready, given the trauma he'd endured and his lack of verbal communication skills. In light of Jill's teaching credentials, The best plan seemed to be for her to tutor him in the fall, then enroll him for the spring semester. No family was located, which surprised neither of them. With Cindy expediting the paperwork, Jill became Kyle's official foster parent in record time. Through it all, Keith provided her with much-needed moral support. Often, he accompanied her on outings with Kyle, his steadfast presence at her side bolstering her courage as she ventured into public and forced herself to return shocked looks with a warm smile, making herself accessible instead of aloof. To her surprise, many people responded in kind, easing her re-entry into society. But the smooth transition was due in large part, she knew, to the man who had changed her life by brightening her world with his simple acceptance and kindness. And he was now working with the same magic on Kyle, slowly breaking through the little boy's barriers. It was understandable that the youngster's trust level with men, in particular, would be low, given his bad experiences with his father and grandfather. But Keith seemed to have an instinctive ability to know how to go about it, and the patience to make the effort. As Jill watched one day from the open kitchen window, Keith's interaction with Kyle reminded her yet again of what a special man had come into her life. That turbulent, stormy, tossed night in July. She'd sent Kyle out to the shed to retrieve a clay pot so that she could split a clump of herbs to share with Madeline. As he trotted back toward the house, Keith called out to him from the corner of the studio. The boy's step faltered, and he turned toward Keith uncertainly, clutching the pot to his chest like a protective shield. "Could you help me for a minute, Kyle? I need someone to hold the other end of this measuring tape while I check my numbers." Keith's tone was pleasant and gentle, his words a request, not a demand. When Kyle didn't respond, Keith tried again. It sure would be a help to me, Kyle. Sometimes an extra pair of hands make a big difference." Still hesitant, Kyle glanced toward the house. Jill stepped back into the shadows, out of Kyle's sight line, but she maintained a clear view of the scene in the yard. After a few seconds, he slowly set the pot on the ground and stared at Keith. "If you can hold this end, I'll be able to get my numbers." Keith offered the tape to Kyle. With slow, cautious steps, the young boy approached him, stopping a couple of feet away. Instead of moving closer, Keith pulled out the tape and stretched the end toward him. "Can you put it there, next to the window?" Kyle edged toward the spot Keith indicated and pressed the tape against the wall, shooting Keith a tentative look. "That's perfect, buddy. Hold it right there." Keith drew out the tape until it extended to the corner of the studio. Then he dropped to one knee to check the number removing a pencil from behind his ear to jot down a few notes. "Just like I figured," he called out. "I need to put another nail in this piece of siding." "You can let the tape go, Kyle. Would you mind handing me that hammer by your foot?" The little boy looked down and reached for the tool. After weighing it in his hands, he headed toward Keith, holding it out from arm's length distance when he drew close. "Thanks, Kyle." Keith positioned a nail and gave it a gentle tap. Then he shook his head and examined his hand. "I'll tell you what. If I hold the nail, do you think you could get it started for me? I banged my thumb the other day, and it's kind of sore. I noticed that you had a good, strong swing when Dominic was here." He extended the handle of the hammer to Kyle, steadied the nail with one hand, and splayed the fingers of the other on the ground to balance him. Each request had drawn Kyle closer. Each had helped convince him that this man wasn't going to hurt him, or criticize him, or berate him, as the other men in his life had done. Just the opposite. Keith was not only building the boy's comfort level, he was helping the youngster feel good about himself, as if he had something to contribute. Mesmerized by the scene unfolding before her, Jill positioned herself in the sunlight for a better view and held her breath as Kyle approached Keith in small, cautious increments. When he drew close enough to take the hammer, Keith dropped his voice, and Jill could no longer hear the quiet conversation taking place. But Kyle's rapt expression told Jill that he was listening intently as Keith gave him some instructions. Then, his face a study in concentration, and wielding the hammer with both hands, he took a swing at the nail. To Keith's credit, he didn't flinch, even though one small miscalculation could have resulted in smashed fingers. Instead, he smiled and encouraged Kyle to take another swing, and then another. Only when the nail and their relationship were secure did Keith remove his hand. Emotion tightened her throat, and she blinked several times to clear the sudden tears that blurred her vision. At that instant, Keith looked up and caught sight of Jill framed in the window, sunlight sparking the fiery highlights in her hair. He hadn't realized he had an audience. His thoughts had been on Kyle alone. For days he'd been trying with limited success to ease the boy's fear of him. Today's inspiration had come to him in the spur of the moment, as he saw Kyle heading toward the tool shed. He hadn't been sure it would work, but he'd been determined to try. He wanted the little boy to realize that not all men were like his father and grandfather, that some were kind and caring and could be trusted. It seemed he'd taken a step in that direction today, and judging from her expression, Jill seemed to think so too. In her eyes, he saw tenderness and gratitude and approval. and a longing so poignant, so intense, that his mouth went dry. Stunned, Keith stared at Jill. For weeks he tried to ignore his growing feelings for the woman who had given him refuge on that stormy summer night. When he could no longer suppress them, he tried attributing them to gratitude. But now he realized they ran deeper than that, far deeper. Deep enough to stir to life and emotion that he'd thought never to experience again. An emotion that Kyle, too, had tapped into in a different way. Confused, Keith turned back to his young helper and murmured a few encouraging words. He wasn't ready to give a name to that emotion yet. But he did know one thing. Here, with Jill and Kyle, he felt at home and at peace, as if this was where he belonged. It was almost as if they were a family, or were meant to be one. And with each day that passed, it was getting harder and harder to even think about walking away. As Jill watched, Keith rose and laid a hand on Kyle's shoulder. Instead of recoiling, the youngster stood stock still and gazed up at him, his eyes filled with hope. Keith smiled and said a few words. And when he turned to go, the little boy trotted after him, close on his heels, the clay pot forgotten. Jill didn't mind. She could split herbs any time. But it wasn't every day that one witnessed a life-changing moment. At Jill's suggestion, they began attending services at a nearby church. She'd gone on occasion in the past, supplementing her infrequent attendance with private Bible study and other spiritual reading. But now that Kyle was in her care, she felt it was important for him to experience a routine of weekly church attendance, as she had. Her own faith had been built on that foundation, and she wanted to offer him the same opportunity. Though she hadn't necessarily expected Keith to accompany them, he'd surprised her by accepting the invitation. They were becoming a regular threesome at the small, white-steepled church. Now, as they sat in the wooden pew with Kyle tucked between them, Jill felt a sense of deep contentment, of rightness. It was the same feeling she'd had years before, when she and Sam and Emily shared a pew on Sundays. A feeling of belonging, of family. Family. A bittersweet yearning swept over Jill, and her throat tightened with emotion. It was an illusion, of course. She was only a foster parent to Kyle, and Keith would soon be moving on. They were merely three people brought together by circumstance for a brief moment in time. Nonetheless, it reminded her of all that she'd once had, and offered her a tantalizing taste of what she'd never thought to find again. But was it possible that she'd been too hasty in writing off the joy of a close and loving family? She suddenly wondered. Why couldn't she consider adopting Kyle? After all, Cindy had told her that few people wanted older children, especially children who came with baggage. The odds were that Kyle would spend his youth in the foster system unless she stepped forward. Yet raising a child alone was a daunting task and not encouraged by social services. Couples were much preferred as adoptive parents. Still, it might be Kyle's best chance for a stable home. The real question was whether she was up to a permanent commitment like that, assuming she'd have to do all the parenting alone. And she had to make that assumption. Despite Keith's kindness, she held no illusions about her ability to attract a man. Whatever beauty she might once have possessed had been marred beyond recognition, and romantic love was based, at least in part, on physical attraction. That didn't mean you had to look like Miss America, but neither could you look well, like Jill Whalen. Maybe, someday, she might meet another man who could learn to overlook her scars and call her a friend, as Keith had. But that was the best she could hope for. If she chose to pursue an adoption, it would have to be with the understanding that she'd be on her own. Now let us stand and turn to number 64 in our hymnals as we raise our voices in song to the Lord. The minister's words and the sudden rustle of movement as the congregation rose brought Jill back to the present. As the organ began the familiar introduction to Amazing Grace, she turned to the correct page. At one point, she'd loved to sing. Now, her husky voice was suited to only the lowest notes. Still, she loved the words of this hymn, as must the minister, who seemed to include it in the services every week. She opened her mouth to sing, but her voice faded when a new soprano joined in the refrain. Startled, her gaze dropped to Kyle, endearing in this new navy blue blazer, his face clean, his cowlick dampened into submission. It was hard to believe he was the same little boy she'd first met, in worn, ragged clothes, with a dirty face and uncombed hair. It was harder still to believe that the sweet soprano voice was coming from him, though his spoken speech was still confirmed to a word or two here and there. In music he seemed to have found a release for the words bottled up inside. Jill looked over his head to Keith, whose pleasing baritone voice had also been silenced by shock. All at once, Kyle seemed to realize that the adults beside him had stopped singing. His voice faltered, and he looked up at them, his expression uncertain. Jill forced a smile to her lips and squeezed his shoulders, then resumed singing. After a glance from her, Keith did likewise. A second later, Kyle joined in. Not only did he have an uncanny ability to memorize lyrics and melodies, Jill realized, he also had a perfect pitch. And if he could sing words, surely he couldn't be far away from saying them. She was anxious to share this latest breakthrough with his therapist. In the meantime, she expressed her gratitude and the quiet of her heart. Thank you, Lord. As they left the service a short time later, Reverend Campbell smiled and held out his hand in welcome. Glad you could join us today again, he greeted them. His shock of white hair and lined face spoke of advanced age, but his grip was firm and strong. I enjoyed your sermon, Jill told him. Thank you, Jill. The man always surprised her with his remarkable facility for names. Even though she'd been an infrequent attendee in the past, and Keith and Kyle were new faces, the minister always remembered their names. It's good to know I'm not going stale after all these years, but I must admit I'm looking forward to retiring next year. In some ways, it will be nice not to have to write a sermon every week, though I expect I'll fill in on occasion back on the mainland to keep my skills fresh. You're moving? Jill inquired. That's the plan. My son and his family live in Oregon, and the wife and I would like to be closer to the grandkids. I can understand that. Children are a great blessing. She rested her hand on Kyle's shoulders. Indeed they are. And I believe I heard you singing this morning, young man. The minister leaned down, putting himself on the boy's level. You have a very fine voice, Kyle. We'll have to think about getting you into the youth choir one of these days. When Kyle dropped his chin and didn't respond, the man stood again. Keep that in mind, Jill, he suggested. I will. And it's good to see you too, Keith. It's always nice to have new people in the congregation. I hope you'll be with us for a while. Well, the studio isn't finished yet, he replied non-committedly. Then I expect we'll be seeing you at a few more services. Yes. Good, good. And remember, if there's ever anything I can do to help, don't hesitate to call. While the man directed the comment to all of them, he held Keith's gaze a second longer than necessary. As they walked back to their car, Keith pondered the man's parting remark. It was almost as if he'd singled Keith out for special attention, as if he knew that the younger man was in need of assistance. In truth, the minister's insight was sound. Time was ticking by. Soon Keith would have some decisions to make, life-changing decisions, and he could use all the help and advice he could get. In the end, it was music that finally unlocked the door to language for Kyle. When Jill shared her experiences at church with Marnie Stevens, Kyle's therapist, the woman began introducing more music to his counseling sessions. She also suggested that Jill play music around the house and encourage Kyle to sing along. It took some experimentation, however, to find the kind of tunes that appealed most to the young boy. Jill tried gospel, country, pop, soft rock, jazz. A song here and there would catch his fancy, but none of the music sustained his interest until at least she hit pay dirt with the scores from the classic Broadway musicals. He could listen for hours to Oklahoma, South Pacific, The Sound of Music, Brigadoon, Camelot. They all captivated him. Soon he was singing along, finding release in the sometimes lyrical, sometimes lively melodies. And nothing warmed Jill's heart more than to hear him singing "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning" at the top of his lungs in the living room, while she prepared meals in the kitchen or worked on her latest painting in the studio upstairs. Once he became comfortable with words and music, he began to use them in speech as well, and his confidence grew. And as it grew, his halting single words gave way to phrases. She and Keith were still waiting for full sentences, but that would come, Marnie assured them. His schoolwork was also progressing. Jill discovered he had a sharp and agile mind, eager for information. He liked to learn and never fussed about spending time with books. She worked with him on his alphabet, while Keith took over simple math tutoring. He was such a keen student that Jill was confident he'd be ready for school after the holidays. The bad dreams, however, were another story. His first few nights in her care had been quiet, giving her a false sense of security that at least the traumas he'd endured didn't plague his sleep. However, a few nights later he'd awakened her with wild sobbing and thrashing, and she'd had to face the reality. His exhaustion the first few nights had been deep enough to dispel his demons, but once he was rested, they'd returned. Since it comforted him to have her nearby, she and Keith moved his twin bed from an alcove in Jill's bedroom closer to her bed. That helped. Still, some nights were rough. Like last night. For whatever reason, he'd been more restless than usual, awakening in tears several times. In the end, Jill had lain beside him, gathering him in her arms until he quieted and at last slept in peace. She, however, had gotten no more than 3 or 4 hours rest. When she dragged herself out of bed the next morning, the dark circles under her eyes were a testament to her weariness. She could only hope a cup of strong coffee would help. 20 minutes later, sipping from an oversized mug in the kitchen, Jill looked over the rim to find Keith at the back door. "Morning. The coffee smells good. Help yourself." Even after all of these weeks, he never entered the house without an invitation. Stepping over the threshold, he headed toward the pot, then stopped in his tracks as he took her one appearance. "You look exhausted." "Rough night." She shrugged and turned toward the stove to prepare breakfast. Moving to the coffee pot, Keith studied her back, noting the weary slump of her shoulders. Considering how her life had been disrupted in the past few weeks, he supposed he shouldn't be surprised. She'd welcomed a stranger into her life, taken in a troubled young boy, re-entered society after years as a recluse, all while she continued to pursue her painting. It would be a lot for anyone to take on, let alone someone who had endured the trauma Jill had. She had more spunk, more courage, more integrity than any woman he'd ever met, and her abundant kindness and compassion bestowed grace on all who touched her life. Soon, the studio would be finished, but something else had begun while he worked to build a place where Jill could create beauty, he realized. Hope had taken root deep in his heart, along with another emotion, one that called for acknowledgement and yearned to be free. Yet just as Kyle had been unable to give voice to words until he'd found the right avenue for release, neither could he give voice to what was in his heart until he put the past to rest once and for all. Only then could he too find release. Only then could he move on. He knew that now, and he knew something else as well. It was time. As the russets and golden hues of fall tinted the island and the studio neared completion, Keith began to spend more time alone. He accompanied Jill less on her outings with Kyle, and often disappeared in the late afternoon for hours at a stretch. Jill supposed he was preparing for a departure that couldn't be too far in the future, though she tried not to think about it, or about the gap his parting would leave in her life. Instead, she reminded herself to be grateful for the gift of new life he'd brought to her. Without his acceptance, his encouragement, his kindness, Jill doubted whether she would ever have had the courage to emerge from the private, safe, but lonely refuge she'd created, and to welcome Kyle into her life. She'd always known Keith would move on, of course. He'd never made any promises about staying, never done anything to suggest he might become a permanent part of her life. After all, he had another life somewhere, a life she knew nothing about. And he continued to carry a sadness he'd never shared with her. That was what had led him to her island in the first place. He'd been running away or toward something when they'd met. And while the pain in his eyes had dissipated since his arrival, it wasn't gone. Keith Michaels still had issues to deal with. Secrecy held close to his heart, and it seemed he would take them with him when he left. For Kyle's sake, Jill did her best to appear happy, confining her heartache to the wee hours of the morning, when she often lay awake thinking about Keith and yearning for something so impossible she refused to even consider it. It was important to stay focused on what was best for Kyle, she'd tell herself. He needed joy in his life, not sadness. Keith continued to do his part to help the little boy heal as well, which only endeared him more to Jill. With infinite patience, he built Kyle's trust until the little boy became his shadow, trotting around behind him, imitating him, eager for his approval and his smiles. The downside to that, though, was that Kyle, too, would be devastated when Keith left. Perhaps that was one of the reasons Keith had slowly begun to withdraw, Jill mused, as she stopped watering the plants on the front porch to watch his car cross the meadow late one afternoon, heading for the road. She lifted her hand to wave as he passed, and he returned the gesture. For a brief instant she thought the car hesitated, as if he had considered stopping to visit with her. But then he kept going. And that was a good thing, Jill told herself. She had dinner to prepare and the little boy to think about. Turning, she moved toward the door and disappeared inside. Watching her go in the rearview mirror, Keith was tempted to stop and follow her. But he had things to do, calls to make, a past to reconcile. They had to be his first priority. Only when he'd put yesterday to rest could he allow himself to think about tomorrow. 45 minutes later, as he waited at the booth in East Sound for his father to pick up the phone, he flexed the tense muscles in his shoulders. A lot depended on this call. Bob Michaels here. Hi, Dad. Hello, Keith. I've been waiting for your call. Did you hear from anyone? Sure did. It's all set up, just like you wanted. 2 weeks from Sunday, 9 o'clock sharp. Reverend Thomas was very cooperative. Sounds like a nice man. He said you wrote a fine letter, and he's willing to do anything that he can to help make things right. He did say he'd like to talk with you before you come, though. The tension in Keith's shoulders eased. Okay. Thanks for coordinating this, Dad. Glad to do it, son. It's important for you to clear the air. Will you have time to pay me a visit while you're in the area? Of course. I'll let you know the final timing when I have everything worked out. God be with you, and with you. Feeling more at peace than he had in years, Keith headed back to his car and pointed it toward Rainbow's End. Jill had told him once that the worn, peeling sign had been there when she purchased the property and that she'd never bothered to remove it. He was glad she hadn't, because it described exactly the way he felt about this place. He hadn't found a literal pot of gold at Rainbow's End, but he had found the golden dawn of a new day, and that was even better. As Keith passed the church where they attended service, he was surprised to see Reverend Campbell in front, planting some chrysanthemums around the sign. Keith slowed the car, then on impulse pulled into the small, empty lot beside the church and headed over to talk with the man. Afternoon, Keith, the minister greeted him, leaning on his shovel. Hello, Reverend. Nice day for gardening. The man chuckled. I doubt these last long, once the deer discover them, but it doesn't sound like fall to me without a few chrysanthemums. Some things just go with certain seasons, you know? Crocuses in the spring, daisies in the summer, mums in the fall, holly in the winter. Of course, I suppose if you grew up in Florida or California, that wouldn't make sense to you. I'm a Midwest boy myself, so I understand. Midwest? Whereabouts? I grew up in Missouri, and I spent several years in Ohio. That's a coincidence. I grew up in Ohio. Where did you live? Maple Ridge. I passed through there once. Pretty little town, I recall. Yes, it is. So what brought you out here? Keith didn't want to dwell on Ohio, not today. The wife and I visited once and decided we liked this little island. Took quite a while to make the move, but in the end, the good Lord must have wanted us here, because I got a call for this church, and I never looked back. It won't be easy to leave. He let his gaze wander over the small white structure nestled in the woods, his expression melancholy. Then he took a deep breath and smiled. But it's time. Funny how God let you know when the time is right for things. That's true. My only concern is finding a replacement. I'd like to get a younger minister here. I think that would be good for the congregation. But young people would probably think this place is too far from the action. It is quiet, true enough, but sometimes it's easier to hear God's voice in the stillness. At least, that's how it worked for Elias. A pensive look came over Keith's face. He'd thought of that passage often in recent weeks, as he soaked up the tranquility of the island. And a great and strong wind before the Lord, overthrowing the mountains and breaking the rocks in pieces. The Lord is not in the wind, he murmured. And after the wind an earthquake. The Lord is not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire. The Lord is not in the fire. And after the fire a whistling of gentle air. And when Elias heard it, he covered his face with his mantle. The minister gave him a shrewd look. You know your Bible. Tell me, Keith, what did you do before you came to Orcas Island? A hot flush rose on his cheek. I was a carpenter. I worked with my dad. Good. Honest profession. Greatest man who ever lived was a carpenter. Well, you seem to have a real interest in the good book. If you ever want to talk more about that, look me up. I'll remember that. But first, I have some things to work through. Past couple of years have been difficult, and I'm still struggling to get back on track. Life can be a trial, no doubt about that. But let me share another favorite verse with you, one that's always given me comfort in hardship. God keeps his promises, and he will not allow you to be tested beyond your power to remain firm. At the same time, you are put to the test. He will give you the strength to endure it, and so provide you with a way out. Corinthians. The man nodded. I thought you might know it. Sometimes, when things are really bad, Even strong faith can falter. Very true. Consider that the disciples themselves had doubts, and they were in the Lord's presence every day. How much harder it is for us to believe without seeing. We're all Thomases to some degree, Keith. I think there are times in almost every life when we lose our way. I know that was true for me. A deep sadness stole some of the light from my eyes. I mentioned my son to you not long ago after services, but I also had two daughters. They were killed in a bus accident on a mission trip to an impoverished area near the Mexican border, 16 and 18, beautiful, intelligent, godly young women who had much to offer. He folded his hands on top of the shovel handle. For months after that, I turned away from God. I didn't understand how he could do that to me, a man who had dedicated his life to spreading the good news. I felt lost and alienated. But when I let the anger go, when I sought God with a humble heart and laid my despair at his feet, he picked me up and led me home. I think he does that for anyone who comes to him in sincerity and humility, and it could be a long, painful journey. A lump rose in Keith's throat. This man, too, had suffered a terrible tragedy, and he, too, had felt abandoned and adrift. Yet in the end, he'd found his way back to God, and in doing so, was able to infuse others with hope. Thank you for sharing that, Reverend. The man laid a hand on Keith's shoulders. I hope it helps you on your journey. I'll keep you in my prayers. I appreciate that. God be with you. As Keith returned to his car, he pondered the chance meeting with the minister. Odd that he'd been out planting mums just as Keith drove by. Yet their impromptu meeting had given him new hope and opened up new possibilities for his future. And as he drove back to a place he was rapidly coming to think of as home, he realized that maybe it hadn't been chance at all. Okay, Jill, I've put them off as long as I can. It's D-Day, yay or nay on the gallery show. Shifting the phone to her shoulder as she stirred a pot of soup, Jill knew she couldn't delay her decision any longer. Madeline had been stalling the Seattle gallery for the past week as her client battled her doubts. While Jill wanted to take advantage of the great opportunity a show would offer, the thought of putting herself in the spotlight still scared her to death. It was one thing to venture out for Kyle's sake, with Keith by her side, ready to catch her when she faltered or stumbled after a particularly strong reaction to her appearance. And there had been a few. In Seattle, however, she'd go on her own, the center of attention. She wasn't sure she was quite ready to make that leap. Jill, are you there? Madeline's voice pulled her back to the conversation. Yes, sorry. Thanks for being patient about this, Madeline. I'd hate for you to pass up this opportunity. They don't come along very often. And you won't have to do this alone, you know. I plan to stick to you like glue. We want to generate some commissions out of this, and I intend to do some very aggressive selling. That's my job. In fact, Jill knew it was more than that. Madeline was also her friend, now that she'd opened the door and let her in. And even before that, the woman had been a strong advocate of her work. She'd also taken a chance on her at the beginning, when Jill had no credentials as an artist. Maybe she owed it to Madeline to agree to the show, and to herself. "You can do this," Jill asserted in the quiet of her heart. "With God's help, and the help of people like Madeline, you'll find the strength." "Okay," Jill said, clutching the phone a bit tighter. A couple of beats of silent pass. "Okay? Yeah, okay." "Well, fabulous. The gallery will be thrilled. I'm thrilled. I'll call them right now and get things set up. Then we need to have lunch to celebrate. Check your calendar, and when I call back with the details on the show, we'll pick a date. And I'm not taking no for an answer." Memories of the horrible lunch with Deb crashed over Jill. So traumatic had the experience been that she hadn't stepped inside a restaurant since. But she didn't look quite as unsightly anymore. Even Dominic had noticed the improvement, and it had been a long time since she'd frightened a child. As for adult reaction, why should she let one mother's inconsiderate actions rob her of the chance to experience a nice meal with a friend in a restaurant? "Okay." Another beat of silence ticked by. "You know, this has all been a far easier sell than I expected," Madeline admitted at last. "Let's just say that it's time I made a few changes in my life, but I may need you to bolster my courage now and then." Jill tried for a teasing tone, but didn't quite pull it off. "I don't think you have anything to worry about on that score, Jill. You're one of the most courageous people I've ever met." Madeline's serious response surprised and touched Jill, but the woman moved on before Jill had a chance to reflect on the comment. "Okay, I'll be in touch. In the meantime, keep painting." That sounded more like Madeline, Jill thought, as she hung up the phone. Yet the woman's first remark replayed in her mind. While she was warmed by Madeline's compliment, Jill knew that she wasn't courageous at all. She was more scared and uncertain and worried than she dared let on, overwhelmed and anxious about all the changes in her life and all the responsibilities she'd taken on. But God seemed to be pushing her in this direction, urging her to revise the plans she'd made for her life when she'd first come to the island more than 2 years ago. And it was important to remember one thing, she reminded herself. His plans were always better.